Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into some really intriguing stuff with 17th century philosopher Nicholas Malebranche. You might have heard of his bold claim that we see all things in God.
Yeah, that's the one that really grabs your attention, isn't it? But it's more than just a theological statement. It's a really deeply philosophical attempt to understand how we perceive the world and grasp knowledge.
Exactly. We're going beyond just religious dogma here, right into the heart of epistemology. Lucky for us, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide. It breaks down some pretty complex concepts like Malebranche's theory of ideas and his approach to sensations, which is pretty unique.
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia is a really great resource for this. It gives a pretty comprehensive overview of Malebranche's philosophy.
So let's start with the central concept, vision in God. What exactly did Malebranche mean when he said we see all things in God?
Well, he don't mean that we literally see some divine being everywhere we look. Malebranche was working within the framework of Cartesian dualism and traditional Christian thought, so he was trying to reconcile our perception of a material world with the existence of an immaterial God.
Cartesian dualism, meaning the separation of mind and body, two fundamentally different substances.
Precisely. And the challenge for Malebranche, who was a devout Christian, was to explain how our minds, being immaterial, could interact with and perceive a material world, especially when God, the ultimate source of reality, is also immaterial.
So how did he bridge that gap?
Well, he introduces this fascinating concept of being in general, an idea he borrows from Aquinas. Instead of seeing God as a specific being, Malebranche posits that God represents being in its most fundamental sense.
So God isn't any particular thing, but the source of all being.
Exactly. Imagine unformed clay from which all specific shapes and forms can be molded. That's similar to Malebranche's idea of God as being in general.
Okay, I can kind of see how that starts to connect. But how does that lead to the idea that we see things in God?
Well, Malebranche argues that the archetypes or blueprints of all things, they exist within this being in general, within God. We're not seeing physical objects directly, but rather their ideal forms as they exist in the mind of God.
So it's like saying when we see a tree, we're not seeing the actual physical tree, but rather God's perfect idea of treeness. It's like we're accessing the blueprint of a tree in the mind of the divine architect.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where Malebranche's theory of ideas comes into play.
Ideas being the fundamental building blocks of thought.
Yes. But Malebranche departs from Descartes on this point. While Descartes believed that ideas were innate to our minds, Malebranche argues that ideas actually reside in God. They're eternal, unchanging, and perfect, reflecting the nature of God himself.
So our minds aren't filled with these ideas from birth, but instead we access them through our connection to God.
Precisely. Malebranche believed that our minds are in constant union with God, allowing us to perceive these divine ideas. It's through this union that we're able to understand and perceive the world around us.
That's a pretty radical departure from the standard view of perception, right? It's not just our senses gathering information, it's our minds connecting to a divine source of knowledge.
And that leads to a really interesting question. If we're only seeing the ideal forms of things, where do our actual sensory experiences fit in? You know, the feeling of rough bark on a tree, the smell of a flower, the taste of an apple, these are all very real and immediate parts of our perception.
Right, it's not like we're walking around in some abstract world of perfect forms. We're experiencing a world that's full of vibrant, tangible details. So how does Malebranche reconcile that with the idea that we see all things in God?
This is where he distinguishes between ideas and sensations. Ideas, those perfect representations residing in God, provide the conceptual framework for our understanding. Sensations, on the other hand, are modifications of our own minds. They provide the subjective, experiential element to our perceptions.
So the idea of fire gives me the concept of fire, but the sensation of burning is a modification of my mind.
Exactly. The sensation of burning isn't inherent to the fire itself, but rather a way our minds experience certain physical interactions.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how these pieces fit together. When I see a tree, I'm accessing the perfect, unchanging idea of treeness in God, but my senses are adding all the specific details of this particular tree. You know, the way the light hits the leaves, the texture of the bark, and so on.
You got it. It's a two-part process. The divine providing the framework in our individual minds, adding the specific subjective details based on our sensory experiences.
Fascinating. But I can't help but wonder, if those sensations are just modifications of our own minds, how can we be sure they accurately reflect the real world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It gets to the heart of skepticism and the reliability of our senses. Malebranche acknowledges this challenge, though. He argues that while our senses can sometimes deceive us, they also provide us with what he calls a natural revelation of bodies.
So he's saying we have a strong inclination to believe our senses are giving us accurate information about the world, even if we can't be absolutely certain.
Exactly. He uses the example of pain. While the sensation of pain is a modification of our minds, it arises in response to something happening in the physical world, some interaction between our bodies and the environment.
So even though the pain itself is subjective, it's grounded in something objective.
That's Malebranche's argument.
Oh.
He's trying to find a middle ground between naive realism, where we blindly trust our senses, and radical skepticism, where we doubt the existence of the external world altogether.
It's a delicate balance, and it seems like Malebranche is really trying to thread the needle here, combining his philosophical insights with his religious beliefs.
He was definitely navigating some complex territory. But before we dive deeper into the implications of his theory, let's take a closer look at why Malebranche rejected innate ideas, a key departure from Descartes.
Okay, I'm all ears. Why did Malebranche think those ideas couldn't just be tucked away in our finite minds from the start?
He starts by emphasizing the inherent qualities of ideas themselves. They possess certain characteristics that, according to Malebranche, simply can't be contained within our limited, finite minds.
What are those characteristics?
He argues that ideas are eternal, meaning they have always existed and will always exist. They're immutable, so they're unchanging and can't be altered. They're necessary, meaning they have to be the way they are and couldn't be otherwise. And finally, they're universal, meaning they're common to all minds.
So these ideas aren't just subjective opinions or fleeting thoughts. They're fundamental truths. They're built into the fabric of reality itself.
Exactly. And that's where Malebranche sees the problem with Descartes' innate ideas. He argues that our minds, being finite, changeable, and limited to our individual perspectives, simply aren't capable of containing such grand, perfect, and universal truths.
So if ideas are the blueprints of reality, they need an architect worthy of them.
Precisely. And that architect is God. Malebranche argues that these ideas, with their eternal, immutable, necessary, and universal qualities, can only reside in an infinite, eternal, and universal mind, the mind of God. He calls God universal reason, the realm where these perfect ideas exist.
It sounds like Malebranche is drawing a lot of inspiration from Augustine here. Weren't Augustine's ideas about divine illumination similar?
You're right to make that connection. Augustine was a major influence on Malebranche, but there are some key distinctions. Augustine focused on seeing truths in God, while Malebranche emphasizes seeing ideas.
Is that a significant difference?
It comes down to their understanding of truth. Malebranche views truth as a relationship between ideas. For him, to see a truth is to grasp the connection between the ideas it depends on.
So, for example, the truth 2 plus 2, 4 is really about the relationship between the idea of 2 and the idea of 4. Those ideas exist in God, and we see the truth by understanding their connection.
Exactly. But perhaps even more importantly, Malebranche extends Augustine's theory to include the perception of material things. Augustine, concerned with preserving God's immutability, could only conceive of seeing eternal and necessary truths in God. He couldn't explain how we could perceive changing, imperfect physical objects in an unchanging God.
That makes sense. It seems like a pretty significant hurdle to overcome. So how did Malebranche address this problem?
He does so by drawing on insights from Descartes. First, he embraces the representational theory of perception, the idea that we don't perceive objects directly but through their representations.
So instead of seeing a physical tree directly, we're seeing its representation, its idea, which exists in God.
Exactly. And these ideas, being part of God, are perfect and unchanging, even though the physical objects they represent might change and decay.
But even if the ideas themselves are unchanging, how do we account for all the specific changing details of our sensory experience? The way the light changes on a tree throughout the day, the way a flower wilts over time, and so on.
This is where Malebranche brings in Descartes' distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Remember, Descartes argued that qualities like color, smell, and texture aren't inherent to the object itself, but are rather sensations produced in us by the interaction between our senses and the object.
Ah, I see where he's going with this. So while the idea of a tree in God contains its essential unchanging properties like shape and extension, it doesn't need to include the constantly shifting colors of its leaves or the texture of its bark, because those are just sensations produced in our minds.
That's the key. By separating out those secondary qualities and attributing them to our own subjective experience, Malebranche is able to preserve the immutability of the ideas in God while still accounting for the variability and change we see in the physical world.
It's a clever workaround. It's like Malebranche took the best of both worlds, combining Augustine's focus on divine illumination with Descartes' insights about representationalism and the nature of perception.
He synthesized these ideas into a truly unique and thought-provoking system. It might seem complex at first, but it provides a surprisingly cohesive explanation for how we perceive and understand a world that seems so different from the divine. But that's just the beginning. There's so much more to unpack, including those arguments Malebranche uses to support his vision in God. Ready to keep diving deeper?
Absolutely. I'm eager to see how he builds his case.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for Malebranche's vision in God, right? We've been looking at how he tries to reconcile the immaterial nature of God with our perception of a material world. Now let's delve into the arguments he uses to support this kind of radical view.
I'm ready. The Stanford Encyclopedia highlighted how he doesn't just rely on theological claims, but builds a really philosophical case, too.
Exactly. Before we get into the specific arguments, though, it's important to remember those two preliminary points we talked about before.
You mean the idea that God contains the archetypes of all things because he's the creator, and the concept that our minds are united with God?
Precisely. These ideas, they kind of establish the plausibility of vision in God, showing how it's possible for us to see things in God. But Malebranche goes further. He offers more systematic reasons why this must be the case.
Okay, so let's hear those arguments. What's the first one on the list?
His first argument focuses on the simplicity of divine action. Malebranche, he was a big believer in God's efficiency and wisdom, He argued that God wouldn't do something in a complex way if a simpler way existed.
Sounds reasonable enough. A divine being wouldn't be a fan of unnecessary steps or complications.
Exactly. He compares vision in God to the alternative. God creating a separate set of ideas within each individual mind. Think about the vastness of our cognitive potential. We can conceive of an infinite number of things.
Infinite shapes, infinite numbers, the possibilities are endless.
Right, and if each mind had its own set of infinite ideas, God would be doing a lot of repetitive work, creating countless identical copies of the same ideas.
It'd be like creating millions of identical libraries when everyone could just share one central library.
Perfect analogy. It's far more efficient for God to have one set of archetypal ideas housed within himself and allow all minds to access those ideas through their union with him.
Elegant and economical, just like a good philosophical theory should be. But it's not just about efficiency, is it? Didn't Malebranche also connect this argument to God's immutability?
You're exactly right. The idea that God's constantly creating these new sets of ideas for every individual mind, it implies change within God. That contradicts the traditional theological understanding of God as unchanging and eternal.
So vision in God allows Malebranche to preserve the traditional attributes of God while also providing a very elegant explanation for our vast capacity for knowledge.
Exactly. It's a brilliant solution. It elegantly addresses multiple philosophical and theological concerns.
I'm convinced by argument number one. What's next on Malebranche's list?
His second argument focuses on our dependence on God. It's a core concept in Christian philosophy. He takes the idea of divine concurrence, the belief that God constantly sustains all our creation, and expands it to encompass our very capacity for knowledge.
So God isn't just keeping the lights on. He's also providing the light by which we see and understand the world.
Precisely. Malebranche argues that vision in God perfectly illustrates this dependence. We don't just perceive objects that God created, we perceive them through him, by accessing the ideas that reside in his mind.
So even our most basic perceptions are acts of participation in the divine.
That's the implication, and it ties into Malebranche's occasionalism, the view that God is the sole true cause in the universe. Vision in God is like the epistemological counterpart to occasionalism, highlighting our reliance on God's wisdom and knowledge, not just his power.
So for Malebranche, every act of knowing is also an act of acknowledging our dependence on God.
Exactly. It's a profound concept that elevates even our simplest observations to a level of theological significance.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What's his next argument? I think the Stanford Encyclopedia called this one Malebranche's strongest.
You're right, it is. And it directly tackles our capacity for infinite thought. Remember, Malebranche points out that we can conceive of an endless number of things.
We've covered that, yes.
Yeah.
Infinite shapes, infinite numbers, and so on.
Right, but he adds another crucial point. To think of any specific thing, we first need some awareness of the whole.
What do you mean by that?
Imagine trying to think of the number 7
Hmm.
without any concept of the number system as a whole. It's impossible. To focus on any specific idea, we need at least an implicit grasp of the totality of possible ideas. It's like needing to understand the concept of color before you can understand red.
So our minds are doing a lot more than we realize, even
Yeah.
for simple thoughts.
Exactly, and here's where the problem arises. How can a finite mind contain this awareness of infinity? How can our limited minds grasp something that extends beyond any boundaries?
Yeah, it does seem like a contradiction.
That's Malebranche's point. The only way for us to have this capacity for infinite thought is if we're connected to an infinite source. And that source, of course, is God. We're not containing infinity within our minds. We're accessing it through our union with God.
So it's like our minds are tuning into a cosmic radio station that's broadcasting all of existence, all of possibility.
That's a great way to visualize it. And Malebranche goes even further, arguing that the idea of the infinite is actually conceptually prior to the finite. We understand specific things by limiting or negating that all-encompassing being in general.
It's like saying we need to understand the whole canvas before we can understand any individual brushstroke.
Exactly. We grasp the particular by recognizing its place within the totality. It's a remarkably nuanced understanding of how our minds work.
Okay, this is starting to feel really mind-bending. What's his next argument?
This one focuses on the causal efficacy of ideas. Malebranche observes that ideas aren't just these passive representations sitting in our minds. They have an active power to influence us.
They can shape our thoughts, trigger emotions, motivate actions. I mean, ideas clearly have a real impact on our lives.
And that's precisely Malebranche's point. He says nothing can act on the mind unless it's superior to the mind. This is an Augustinian principle that he embraces wholeheartedly.
So if ideas are having such a profound effect on us, they can't just be products of our own finite minds.
Exactly. The cause must be something higher, something capable of producing these powerful effects. And since ideas are demonstrably impactful, Malebranche concludes that they must be divine in origin.
Like the effects of the ideas point back to their ultimate source, God.
Precisely. It connects back to the idea of God as the true light. He's not just illuminating a pre-existing world. He's actively shaping our very perceptions through his ideas, guiding our understanding, and shaping our experience.
That's 4 pretty powerful arguments down. What's the final reason Malebranche gives for his vision in God?
His final argument centers on the purpose of creation. Malebranche, following traditional Christian theology, argued that God, being perfectly self-sufficient, can only act for his own glory. He's not creating to fill some need or void, but to express his perfection and draw us closer to him.
That makes sense, but we obviously experience and know things other than God. How does that fit into this framework?
That's where vision in God provides the key. Malebranche argues that our knowledge of the created world is always intertwined with our knowledge of God. We can't truly understand creation without seeing the Creator reflected in it.
So even our scientific explorations, our attempts to understand the physical world, are ultimately leading us back to God.
That's exactly how Malebranche sees it. He doesn't see a separation between our pursuit of knowledge and our pursuit of the divine. They are, in his view, inseparable facets of the same journey.
Wow. So it's a very grand and unifying vision. It challenges the common perception of a divide between science and religion.
It certainly does, and it raises all sorts of fascinating questions about the nature of knowledge, perception, and even the limits of human understanding.
It does feel like we've just scratched the surface here.
Mhm.
There's so much to unpack in terms of the implications of this theory.
You're absolutely right, but there's one more crucial development in Malebranche's thought we need to examine, one that ties everything together in a really fascinating way.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more.
It revolves around the idea that ideas aren't just representations. They're causally efficacious, meaning they have the power to affect our minds and shape our experiences.
We touched on that earlier with the argument that the power of ideas points to their divine origin, but it sounds like there's more to this story.
There is. This development was prompted by a challenge from one of Malebranche's critics, Pierre Sylvain Regis.
So even in the 17th century, philosophers were engaging in lively debates and pushing each other to refine their ideas.
Absolutely. These intellectual sparring matches often led to some of the most important advancements in philosophical thought.
Okay, so what was Regis's objection?
Regis, he was skeptical of the idea that the mere presence of God to our minds was enough to explain how we see things in Him. He argued that this union had to be causal in nature, with God actively acting on the mind.
So Regis was pushing Malebranche to clarify how this vision in God actually worked,
Hmm.
how it wasn't just a passive observation, but an active process.
Precisely, and this was a significant challenge because if God is directly causing our perceptions, it seems like we're back to a more Cartesian view where ideas are in our minds implanted or caused by external objects, or in this case, God.
So Malebranche needed a way to explain how we see things in God without making God directly responsible for implanting ideas in our minds. How did he address this?
His solution is brilliant. He argues that physical objects being inert and invisible in themselves can't directly act on the mind. They lack the causal power to produce ideas or perceptions within us.
But ideas, being part of God's substance, do have that causal power. They're the instruments through which God enlightens us, shaping our sensory and intellectual experiences.
Exactly. It's not just that we passively see the world in God, it's that God actively shows us the world through his ideas. This marks a subtle but crucial shift in Malebranche's thought, from vision in God to vision by God.
So it's like God is the ultimate puppeteer, and ideas are the strings by which he animates our minds and orchestrates our experience of the world.
It's a provocative image, but it captures the dynamic nature of Malebranche's vision. Ideas are no longer just these static blueprints residing in God. They're active agents in the process of cognition, shaping our entire experience of reality.
This really strengthens the connection between his occasionalism and his vision in God.
Right.
God is the sole true cause acting in the world through these divinely empowered ideas.
Exactly. It creates this beautifully unified system where everything ultimately traces back to God's action. It's a bold and ambitious vision that challenges our common sense assumptions about how we perceive and understand the world.
It certainly does, and I'm guessing it also generated a fair amount of controversy and debate among Malebranche's contemporaries.
You're absolutely right. A theory this radical was bound to attract criticism, and Malebranche had his share of detractors, both on theological and philosophical grounds.
Okay, let's dive into those criticisms next. I'm curious to see how his opponents challenged his ideas.
All right, so we've spent some time really exploring the ins and outs of Malebranche's vision in God.
Yeah.
This theory that's trying to bridge this gap between our finite minds and the infinite realm of divine knowledge.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold system, pretty elegant too. But like with any groundbreaking philosophical theory, it faced some pushback, right? Some criticism.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not every day a philosopher pops up and tells us we're seeing the world through God's mind. So what were some of the main objections raised against Malebranche's vision in God?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. Give me the highlights.
Well, the criticisms came from all sorts of angles. Some were practical, some theological. But for our purposes, let's just stick to the internal critiques, the ones that really challenge the logic, the coherence of the theory itself.
Sounds good. Let's hear it.
So one common objection was aimed at the very foundation of the theory. Critics argued that, okay, even if we accept that ideas can't reside in our finite minds, why should we just assume they got to reside in God? Why not just say there's some third realm where these eternal, immutable ideas hang out?
Like a Platonic world of forms. It's a separate realm of pure abstract entities.
Exactly. Malebranche kind of saw this objection coming, though. He argued that such a realm wouldn't really solve the problem. It just pushes the question back a step. Even if these ideas exist in some other realm, how do our minds access them? How do they become present to our thought?
Plus, wouldn't that be introducing another unnecessary entity into a system, violating that principle of simplicity we talked about?
Precisely. Malebranche was committed to explaining our cognitive abilities in the simplest, most parsimonious way possible. Another line of criticism targeted the very concept of God as being in general. Some philosophers, like Antoine Arnauld, they found this notion just too abstract, too impersonal.
It does seem like it might clash with the more personal, relational God of Christian theology.
Yeah, that was part of the concern. I raised all these questions about how such an abstract God could relate to humanity. How could we pray to or connect with a being that seems so devoid of specific attributes?
Even on purely philosophical grounds, it seems kind of problematic. If God is this undifferentiated unity, how can he contain distinct ideas? Wouldn't that contradict the idea of divine simplicity?
It's a valid point. Malebranche, he does appeal to the concept of divine incomprehensibility, acknowledging that our finite minds can't fully grasp the nature of God.
But that might feel like kind of a cop-out to people who demand clear and distinct explanations.
Yeah, it doesn't satisfy everyone, and the criticism didn't stop there. Another target was the very idea of intelligible extension, the concept that we perceive all material things through this one, overarching idea in God.
Right. If I remember correctly, intelligible extension is Malebranche's way of answering the question of how we can perceive an extended physical world through an unextended spiritual God.
You got it. It's a really crucial part of his theory, but critics question how something purely spiritual could represent something material. How can something without extension itself embody the concept of extension?
Seems counterintuitive, to say the least.
For sure. Malebranche tries to address this by distinguishing between the way God sees extension and the way we do. He argues that God contains the perfections of material things eminently in this higher spiritual sense.
So it's not that God literally has extension, but that he contains the idea of extension in a way that transcends our limited understanding.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. But it still leaves this question, of how we, with our unextended minds, are able to grasp this idea of intelligible extension.
It seems like it requires some special kind of intellectual intuition, something beyond our ordinary sensory experiences.
And that's precisely what Malebranche argues. He claims that it's through our union with God, our participation in his being, that we're able to access this knowledge.
But that explanation, for some, might feel a little too mystical, relying more on faith than reason.
Right. It does kind of push the limits of what we can clearly and distinctly understand through pure logic and observation. And then there's this whole issue of sensations. Remember, Malebranche says sensations are modifications of our minds, not inherent to the objects themselves.
Right, which explains why a rose isn't really red. Redness is just our experience of it.
But this brings up a new problem. How do these subjective sensations interact with those objective, perfect ideas in God? How do they color our perception of intelligible extension?
It seems like he's trying to mix oil and water. How can these two fundamentally different things, subjective sensations and objective divine ideas, combine to create our unified experience of the world?
Yeah. Malebranche resorts to metaphors. He talks about sensations being projected or painted onto this canvas of intelligible extension, but these are just analogies. They don't really fully explain the mechanism by which this interaction takes place.
Right, they leave open this question of how those subjective elements get integrated with the objective framework provided by God's ideas.
Exactly. And this leads to an even deeper question. If our sensations are just modifications of our minds, can we really be sure they're accurately reflecting the real world?
I mean, couldn't we be living in kind of a self-created illusion, a world constructed by our own minds rather than a true reflection of external reality?
It's a valid concern, one that Malebranche tries to address through his arguments for the reliability of our senses, our natural inclination to trust what our senses are telling us.
But those arguments, because they're based on experience, are always subject to skeptical challenges. I mean, we know our senses can deceive us. We've all experienced illusions and misperceptions.
True. And ultimately, even with all its ambition, all its elegance, Malebranche's system doesn't completely eliminate the possibility of skepticism. It doesn't provide this absolute, unshakable certainty about the nature of reality.
Yeah. But even if it doesn't completely shut the door on doubt, it offers this really fascinating, thought-provoking framework for understanding some of the most fundamental questions in epistemology.
Yeah, for sure. It forces us to rethink our assumptions about perception, the relationship between mind and world, and the role of the divine in our very act of knowing.
It reminds us that philosophy isn't just about about finding answers. It's about asking the right questions,
Mm-hmm.
pushing the boundaries of our understanding, exploring these new ways of thinking about ourselves and the universe.
And Malebranche, even with those controversial claims, he definitely pushes us to think differently, expands our horizons, and challenges us to consider these alternative ways of approaching the big questions.
So after this deep dive into Malebranche's vision in God, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be pondering as they go about their day?
I think the most important question to consider is this. If we do, in some sense, see all things in God, even if it's just a glimpse or a partial reflection, how does that change? How does that change our perspective? Does it change the way we view the world, the way we approach knowledge, and even the way we understand our relationship to the divine?
That's a lot to think about. I feel like I need to go for a walk in nature and contemplate all this for a while. Maybe I'll see some divine ideas reflected in the trees.
That sounds like an excellent plan. Until next time, keep diving deep.